program will now begin.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to this virtual event to launch the publication Securitizing Youth, Young People's Roles in the Global Peace and Security Agenda. I'm Melanne Verveer, the director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and we are thrilled to be collaborating on this event with Dr. Marisa Ensor, who is with Georgetown's Justice and Peace Studies program. She's also the editor of the work we will be discussing. I'm very excited about this publication because of its important contribution that it will make to peace and security. You might ask, why youth? Too often we talk about the youth bulge in countries around the world as a threat. We focus on the potential problems posed by massive numbers of young people without future prospects for employment, or we focus on radicalized youth. Too often, however, we don't focus on youth, both women and men, as a demographic dividend, nor in this context do we understand the potential of young people in advancing peace and security. And that's just what this book does. As I wrote in endorsing it, it provides keen insights on the positive role young people play in their engagement and mediation of local conflicts, in addressing climate change, in the role that they play in transitional justice, and so much more. The chapter cites specific examples of the difference youth are making despite the odds they often confront. In 2015, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2250, which recognizes the role of youth in peace and security. One of the chapters of Securitizing Youth provides an excellent case study on Afghanistan, for example, a country which has experienced protracted conflict. Afghanistan also has one of the youngest populations in the world. 63% of the population is under the age of 25. And to a significant degree, Afghanistan's future will depend on them. Yet it is so striking how infrequently youth are mentioned in discussions on Afghanistan, and I've been in plenty of them. And yet peace building and the future of their country depends to some extent on them. 15 years earlier, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 and 9 additional resolutions over the years, linking women to peace and security. And today we have an evidence-based case supporting the role that women play and the impact they have in all aspects of peace building, peace negotiations, and post-conflict relief and recovery. And yet the pace of women's full and meaningful participation is not quite what it should be. I have met so many young women peace builders who are on the front lines of change, creating a better life for their communities and engaging in creative problem solving. Their efforts and voices are truly vital, and we need them. There is obvious synergy between the women peace and security and the youth peace and security agendas. And I'm pleased that my Institute colleagues, both past and present, contributed to a chapter on the intersections between these two agendas. I'm looking forward to today's discussion among the participants who will share their findings and recommendations on how we can advance the role of youth in peace and security. And before I turn this over to our moderator, I want to thank Marisa and all the contributors for their impactful work. And now I'm pleased to turn to my colleague, Dr. Jenny Klugman, the Managing Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Take it over, Jenny.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you all for joining today. We especially welcome this opportunity, as has already been indicated, because we see a key part of our role in drawing together kind of coalitions and overcoming silos. And I think that's what the potential and the excitement around this book and its contribution to thinking and advancing both thinking and actions on the ground. My role today is limited to moderation, so I'll be introducing our very august panel, trying to keep time and allowing and sharing questions that we've gotten in advance from the audience and those that we receive today via the chat. Just to give you a sense of the run of show, initially Marisa, Dr. Ensor will provide an overview of the book, and she'll be followed by 3 of the chapter contributors, whom I will introduce in turn. We'll then have a couple of broad questions for our panel, and then turn to audience questions. So please feel free to begin to submit those, which we'll capture and address as far as we can today, and also in terms of follow-up. So turning initially to introduce Dr. Marisa Ensor. As mentioned, she's a colleague at Georgetown at the Justice and Peace Studies program. Has an intriguing background in anthropology and human rights law, and I think brings fascinating insights and approaches to her work. She's worked extensively in conflict-affected, fragile and transitional countries all around the world. She's prolific on the publication front, and she's also done very important work in terms of considering the links between peace and security and environmental threats, forced displacement, as well as the role of peace building and reconciliation. And of course, with a focus on gender and youth. So thanks very much, Marisa, for bringing us all together in putting together this volume. And over to you to get us even more excited about the book. Thanks. You're on mute.
So once again, many thanks, Jenny, for that introduction, for the brilliant chapter you co-authored for our volume, and for agreeing to moderate this panel discussion. And my deep gratitude to Ambassador Melan Verveer and the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security for facilitating this event and offering this opportunity to discuss our latest publication on securitizing youth. Now, I've been working with young people in writing about their experiences and engagement in a wide range of areas, usually in situations of adversity, conflict, disasters, complex emergencies, forced migration, risk of radicalization, poverty, and food insecurity for almost 2 decades now. And yet, I didn't intentionally set out to study children and youth. The variable that has always guided my analysis is gender power dynamics and their impact on women's and men's experiences in these adverse situations. But because young people often constitute the largest demographic sector in fragile and conflict-affected countries, it became necessary to pay close attention to their position in society as a matter of inductive logic, that is, from the ground up. Now, for this project, I didn't want to write a book about youth, but rather collaborate with youth engaged in the peace and security field. Securitizing Youth is therefore an edited volume, and several of the chapters have been authored by young peace builders themselves. My young fellow panelists are among the contributors. And so the book is the result of our collective efforts to analyze and unpack the recent proliferation of international activity on youth, peace, and security. This current interest in young people's experiences in social, political, and environmental agency has been motivated by demographic imperatives, as well as geopolitical realities. As was noted in the introductory remarks, today's generation of youth is larger than it has been at any other time in human history. Perhaps more telling is the fact that more than 600 million of those youngsters live in conflict-affected regions. In this context, as the concept of national security has been expanded to the broader construct of human security, security agendas have been globalized. Security concerns in the global north are linked to, among other processes, political unrest, environmentally induced displacement, and fragility in more peripheral regions of the global economy, where most of these young people live. This global security agenda has been further driven by moral panics over the assumed growing threat of radicalization of globally connected but marginalized youth by media-savvy extremist groups. An important landmark of this global geopolitical landscape was, as already noted, the adoption in December 2015 of the UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace, and security. Resolution 2050 represents the first time that the Security Council had directly addressed the central role of youth in global security concerns. It is part of a larger set of recently developed international policies and conferences on youth and security. I won't list them here. I'll just point out that 2050 is the best known, but by no means the only one. It's also worth noting that the recent ascendance of youth in global narratives of peace, security, and the environment has not been universally celebrated. Critics of this agenda have pointed out that recent documents on global youth and security are saturated with concerns with youth as threat and liability. Resolution 2050 warns that the rise of radicalization to violence and violent extremism, especially among youth, threatens stability and development. This pervasive focus has resulted in the increasing securitization of youth. And this is where the title of the book comes from. That is the propensity for young people to be seen almost exclusively through a lens of threat and insecurity. Our findings indicate that even youth-led peace-building organizations are not impervious to this tendency. Detractors also highlight the disconnection between discourse and practice and the challenges or even desirability of applying global frameworks to particular local realities. Others have voiced a concern with the overly optimistic, but empirically unproven as yet, expectation that youth engagement would automatically result in positive gains. Some scholars and policy analysts have argued that this ideal of youth as peace builders has served as a pretext for instrumentalizing youth and as a strategy for eliciting youth support for the current global social and economic order. It has also been noted that the inclusion and application of gender in the YPS agenda needs to be further developed and solidified as key cross-cutting provisions, correcting the lack of intersectional approaches. Youth, particularly male youth, are often branded as the main protagonist of criminal and political violence, and consequently, much of contemporary discussion carries unfavorable notions against youth, demonstrated by negative connotations surrounded concepts such as the youth bulge or at-risk youth. These stereotypes are perpetuated by the media, where youth are simultaneously infantilized and demonized, perceived to be vulnerable and in need of protection, but also denounced as dangerous, violent, and apathetic. As a result, the role that prevalent notions of masculinity play in conflict and peace tends to be disregarded, while the category female youth has often been ignored. This has also contributed to the essentializing treatment of youth, and it has led to the victimization of young women and sexual and gender minorities, especially during conflict, but also in times of peace. Our analysis indicates that current policy and practice have not yet fully overcome these common shortcomings, thereby reducing the effectiveness of peace-building interventions. Okay, so what are the key thematic areas revealed by the empirical evidence? Well, we have identified 8 main themes in no particular order. 1, preventing and countering violent extremism, and Ali will elaborate on this point. Conflict, violence, and fragility, which is the context in which Victoria's chapter on young people's involvement in processes of transitional justice in Rwanda takes place. The violence of exclusion, that's 3. 4, education and employment as peace and security concerns. 5, youth and social media. 6, youth mobility and forced displacement. 7, environmental governance and climate change. And well, in addition to my introduction and conclusion chapters, bringing it all together, my own individual chapter focuses on this topic, environmental governance and climate change, with special attention to gender differences. And 8, gender dynamics, which is a cross-cutting theme throughout this entire volume and in anything I do. Let me see how I'm doing with time. Not well. So yeah, I'm going to add that. So real quickly to conclude, analysis of females' actions have been closely shaped by gender stereotypes that neglect or misrepresent female agency. The lack of political, economic, and educational development for girls is a symptom of many societies' failure to see women as political, economic, and educated actors. This pattern, which is particularly pervasive in conflict-affected contexts, distorts interpretations of young women's engagement in armed struggles and peace-building efforts. Inaccurate assumptions about the motivations, needs, and contributions of women and girls have served to limit engagement with female actors in peace-building efforts. And that before I turn the floor to Matt, since I'm running out of time, I just want to conclude by noting that it is critical to apply both gender and age lenses together with any other pertinent variables, such as class, ethnicity, religion, displacement status, and to ensure that the participation of young women, not only young men, in the design and implementation of programs and policies. And now I'm going to turn the floor to Matt, who is going to discuss his chapter in which he does precisely that, apply both gender and age lenses to the youth peace and security paradigm. Right, thank you.
Thanks, Marisa. Let me just briefly introduce Matt, and also thank you for your great overview, I think highlighting the potential, but also drawing attention to constraints and risks, and of course, the importance of intersectionality among other aspects that we need to think about more deeply. It's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Moore, and we actually co-authored a chapter in this volume. Matt and I worked very closely together when he was the law fellow, the Hillary Rodham Clinton Law Fellow with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security in 2018-19, and we've worked on various research projects since then. Matt is eminently qualified with a JD from Georgetown, a master's degree from Columbia University. He's got great experience in terms of legal analysis, both in the US and more broadly, and has done really interesting field research in Colombia, and worked as well with Human Rights Watch and the Carnegie Council. So over to you, Matt. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Jenny, for the kind introduction. And also thank you to Marisa for organizing this volume, which I was able to contribute to with Jenny, and also to GWIPS for hosting today's event. It's good to be with you, at least virtually. So our chapter looks at the links between the women, peace and security, and youth agendas. WPS agenda, as Ambassador Revere pointed out, was formally established in 2000 by Resolution 1325. Like the Youth and Peace and Security agenda, it aims to reverse exclusion and promote inclusion in peace and security. So we wanted to know how have the agendas informed each other in practice, and especially given the additional 15 years of WPS experience, what lessons are there for implementation for the youth agenda? So our chapter does this in 3 ways. First, we look at data to find out where do the needs of women and youth, particularly in fragile and conflict settings, overlap. Next, we look at the UN resolutions that establish the agendas to find out whether these documents actually point to these places of overlap. And lastly, our chapter concludes by talking about Colombia, Afghanistan, and the United Kingdom, where both agendas overlap and have unique implications. So obviously that's a lot. Today I'll just briefly sketch some of our findings and give some thoughts on what they suggest. First, the data. So we used a statistical innovation, the Women, Peace, and Security Index, to get an idea of how the well-being of women and youth are related. The WPS Index measures progress on women's inclusion, security, and justice across 11 indicators. So the most recent index, which came out last year, I believe, covers 167 countries. And the top ranking country was Norway, and Yemen performed the worst on the index. So we wanted to know, do countries that perform well on the WPS index also perform well as to youth indicators? And to assess this, we looked at two really important youth indicators. The first is the NEET rate for youth, which is youth not in employment, education, or training, which is really important because people who fall into this group have diminished prospects in the future for labor force participation. So we found that there was a strong correlation between countries that performed well on the index and the youth NEET rate, about 0.55. So what that shows is that countries that tend to do well on measures of justice, inclusion, and security for women also tend to do well for youth NEET. We also looked at adolescent fertility, which is another very important youth indicator, and found another strong correlation. Here, no country that was in the top 25% of the WPS index had a high adolescent fertility rate. So all of the countries uniformly that performed well on the index had good or low adolescent fertility rates. So again, these initial results suggest that good performance on the index equals good performance on some really important youth indicators. So we can't infer causality from this, but we can say that looking at some initially important indicators, performance for youth and performance for women seems to be related. In other words, better outcomes for one group may translate into better outcomes for the other, which reinforces the intuition that the youth and women, peace, and security agendas are highly related and have a lot of overlaps. So the next part of our chapter looks at the UN resolutions that define both agendas. These are the documents where the international community sets out what's important in each agenda and where there are clues as to where these agendas overlap. And we looked in detail at the language of these resolutions, which I won't recount all here, but a few interesting points can be pulled out. The first is that, of course, the resolutions came about in very different contexts. So Resolution 2250 was actually announced on Instagram by Prince Hussein of Jordan, who was the chair of the debate at which the YPS agenda was crafted. So I didn't research this, but I'm pretty certain it may be the first resolution to have been announced on Instagram. The WPS agenda obviously came about in 2000, was not. Another difference is that Resolution 2250 emphasizes partnerships in the funding and resourcing of UN agencies and actors on the ground. And we thought this was really encouraging. A key lesson from the WPS agenda is that lack of funding has been a stumbling block to full implementation of the agenda on the ground. So it's possible that in crafting 2250, folks at the UN learned that lesson from the WPS experience. An area of concern, though, was the lack of attention in Resolution 2250 to formal monitoring mechanisms. Now, these are mechanisms in the Women, Peace, and Security agenda that allow the international community to monitor progress on the agenda both globally and in countries. So examples are the Security Council debate every year on women, peace, and security, and the Independent Experts Group, which monitors progress. So this was worrying because even with these mechanisms, arguably, monitoring and accountability have been insufficient to ensure full implementation of the women, peace, and security agenda. So the youth agenda, at least initially, had even fewer mechanisms to monitor progress. A bit of good news is that the most recent youth resolution, 2535, did ask the Secretary General to issue biennial reports on youth, peace, and security. So this is not as much monitoring and accountability as is in the WPS agenda, but still a step in the right direction. So that's good news. Another area that we looked at critically in 2250 was the absence of language specifically on gender and young women and the challenges they face. And again, the more recent resolution actually devotes significant attention to this and shows that the UN is recognizing how central the experiences of young women are for these agendas. So I believe I may be running short on time as well. Our chapter briefly looks at 3 case studies: Colombia, Afghanistan, and the United Kingdom, which I'm happy to discuss in the questions if folks have questions. But now I'll turn it over to Ali.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. And let me just briefly introduce Ali Altiok. I think it's a nice segue because he's been, I think, extensively and deeply immersed in a number of the UN processes, and so I think can give us interesting perspectives there. He's a researcher and advocate on youth and peace building. He's authored and co-authored some of the key papers for the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, and worked on the Missing Peace Program. He founded the Young Peace Researchers Group at the UN Network on of young peace builders, and has worked with the Open Society Foundation, Interpeace, and elsewhere. So glad to have you with us, Ali. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. And also I would like to thank Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security for hosting this event on young people's role in the global peace and security agendas. So I just would like to start with what do we mean by securitization, because the subject of this discussion is securitization, and I want to clarify a little bit. Securitization is a process in which issues that are handled in other sectors that are being pulled into security issues. So this is basically about creating new threats. Young people and their issues often become the main object of this threat creation exercise in state-society relationship. Governments increasingly stereotype young people as a threat to be contained or as security risks to be prevented, or passive vulnerable actors who are at risk of violent threats. These perceptions are also highly gendered. Young men often portrayed as a threat perpetrator, young women at risk of experiencing this threat, in other words, being victim. So the process of securitization intervenes in the lives of young people by presenting youth unemployment or under-education of young people as a threat that should be tackled in the field of security. While youth unemployment or lack of education would and should normally be addressed as a socioeconomic problem. The process of securitization intervenes in the lives of young people by presenting mental health challenges as an indicator of radicalization into violent actions, when such issues would normally and should normally be addressed through providing psychosocial support services. So securitization process stereotypes unemployed, out of school, troubled, or any ordinary young person from racial, ethnic minorities as potential security threats. So when it comes to global dimensions of securitization, what we can observe is that in the past 2 decades, states and governments relied on these stereotypes to develop new international approaches that are securitizing social, political, economic, mental well-being of young people. Particularly, international counter-terror approaches, including the soft ones, so-called countering and preventing violent extremism, has been the main vehicle used by states to securitize young people. I will mention few counterproductive results to explain why it is bad to securitize young people through counter-terror approaches. First, securitization of youth through counterterrorism, closing the civic space rather than protecting it. So counter-terror legislations measures enable untrustworthy security actors to penetrate into civic spaces to silence, regulate, and criminalize youth protest and dissent. Both in authoritarian and democratic countries, government through preemptive surveillance of public spaces, educational institutions, govern, control, suppress, and discourage youthful politics. Labeling youth as potential violent extremists, which often starts with youth from ethnic, religious, or racial minorities, then expands to any youth movements demanding social change. This brings me to my second point about youth and social change. Securitization of young people through counterterrorism approaches pathologize young people demanding a radical change. Counterterrorism policies rely on flow radicalization and de-radicalization concepts to expand the scope of these interventions. So the expansion, this expansion labeled young people who want to drive social change as radicalized into violent extremism. This is particularly the case when the ideas of young people do not favor their governments. As a result of these counterproductive policies, young people are more afraid of their governments than extremist armed groups, as the study from UNDP found based on over 700 interviews with young people in so-called violent extremist hotspots. So third, securitization of young people through counterterrorism stifles positive resilience of young people. Civic spaces are the primary fora where young peace builders operate, build civic trust, and foster social cohesion. Downstream impact of these international counterterror approaches enable governments to narrow or close civic spaces. This has become the main obstacle for young people to transform violent conflicts, build peace, address underlying patterns of marginalization and exclusion. These approaches curtail transformative agency of young people by violating their freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So governments portray youth dissent and protest as a threat to liberal democracy, while youth dissent and protest should normally be an essential element of healthy liberal democracy. Fourth, securitization of youth through counterterrorism distorted programmatic interventions and international peacebuilding. CVE, PVE converted youth programs, youth empowerment, employment, education programs into security interventions. When youth programs are associated with security interventions, we have seen that due to mistrust into security actors, marginalized and excluded young people do not want to participate into international peacebuilding programs. So lastly, securitization of youth through counterterrorism also maintains and fosters social inequalities. So just the interest rate of the military-oriented counterterror interventions costs $8 trillion, according to the study conducted by Watson Institute. So young people and children will acquire this huge debt in the United States. So I would like to end my presentation with like what I argued in this chapter. So I argue that securitization is a dynamic process. It's an interactive process. Securitized young people engage in activities to challenge, disrupt the ways in which securitization works. Since the downstream impact of international counterterror approaches paved the way for state violence against young people, I argue that international youth peacebuilding networks engage in policy advocacy work with multilateral institutions and states to resist and disrupt to the ways in which international counterterror approaches enables their governments to harm, control, and suppress young people. So young people have a form of peace-building agency, which has been increasingly interacting with international peace and security frameworks, actors, and institutions. Young people build multi-level advocacy strategies and tactics, and also form coalitions with key actors this includes UN, INGOs, and governments, to challenge and disrupt the ways in which international policy frameworks present young people as a threat or risk. So in this respect, in my interpretation, the Global Youth Peace and Security Agenda, which critics criticize, what Marisa mentioned, is that which has been formalized by the UN Security Council 2250 in 2015, is a tool that young people use to slow down, challenge, and disrupt the growing global counterterrorism architecture. Thank you. Jenny, I hand over to you back.
Thank you so much, Ali. And let me just turn now to Victoria Bishop, who has a background in applied statistics and sociology. She's currently with another of the major think tanks in Washington, DC, the US Institute of Peace, where she works on women building peace and builds on previous experience at the International Republican Institute, at the Center for Global Impact, as well as in the DC Mayor's Office. So a fascinating background. Over to you, Victoria, before we go to questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to you all. It's been lovely being a part of this panel. So as Marisa mentioned earlier, in my chapter, I analyze how Rwanda's transitional justice processes and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, or DDR initiatives, offer valuable lessons on young people's experiences, both as objects of and actors in a range of post-1994 genocide rehabilitation and reintegration. Post-genocide Rwanda is illustrative of the progressive securitization of youth. And as Ali mentioned just a minute ago, that is the tendency to consider youth primarily or even exclusively in terms of their relation to security matters. Transitional justice paradigms, whether that be restorative, traditional, and so on, are common mechanisms through which societies emerging from conflict deal with unresolved legacies of the past. So to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation. Implementation of these TJ mechanisms have been complicated by increasingly securitized constructions of youth. So this is necessary to note because youth and young women and young men are critical stakeholders of these initiatives and overall peace-building processes. So TJ and DDR measures and programs must be creatively designed and implemented while considering the coexistence of both agency and vulnerability among conflict-afflicted youth. So it replaces the outdated paradigm on assumed fragility and victimhood. Most importantly, youth's meaningful participation and engagement in the design of these initiatives and mechanisms requires the delicate balance between trauma and resiliency. To dive a little bit deeper into disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, successful DDR programs are often necessary basis for peace for countries emerging from conflict, and reintegration is often the precursor for sustaining this peace. However, the link between securitized constructions of youth and youth-related justice processes do not always promote meaningful disengagement and reintegration. So a wide range of TJ and DDR initiatives were implemented in Rwanda in the years following the genocide. The United Nations Security Council established the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR. There was the RDRC, which was the Rwanda Demobilization and Reintegration Commission Program, and many others. But in this chapter, I specifically focus on the Gacaca court system. Gacaca in Kenya, Rwanda can be translated to mean the place where communities gather to resolve conflicts. So this was a hybrid transitional justice approach, which consisted of community-based judicial forums to address the concerns of the country coming to terms with justice and reconciliation. These gacaca gatherings have been an aspect of Rwandan culture dating back to pre-colonial British rule to settle land disputes. But what did these court systems mean for the nearly estimated 4,500 youth that were detained in prisons after the genocide? Rwanda became the first country to try minors for committing acts of genocide. So the age of criminal responsibility was 14 years old at the time of the crime. So children under the age of 14 at the crime were not held legally responsible for their actions or detained, even though some were. And then those who were 14 to 18 were tried, but they received reduced penalties. So once the gacaca courts were implemented in 2002, so a few years after the genocide ended, the processing of alleged perpetrators at the time, who were minors, so 14 to 18, was especially challenging because now at this point during these hearings, these minors have now passed the age to receive the reduced penalties and aged out of that time frame, and had to show proof that they were indeed 14 to 18 at the time of the genocide. But that's more nuance there, but I see I'm running out of time a bit, so I'm gonna skip to the next part. So after the gacaca court system and hearings and youth were being released and the phase of reintegration started. So Rwandans' youth and the participation in gacaca processes, it represented this form of disengagement and facilitated their reintegration back into society. However, there was this lingering stigmatization of youth perceived as security threats, which created considerable obstacles in their path toward successful reintegration and overall sustainable peace. So also keeping in mind what my fellow panelists have also said, is that when we're discussing gender differences, the term gender is assumed and coterminous with women and adult women. But on the flip side, when speaking of youth, the subtext commonly references male youth, which leaves female youth largely ignored. And also, for an example, following the genocide, a lot of international domestic funding and programming sought to promote reconciliation and healing for female survivors, for women, but admittedly a smaller number of young boys and who are also survivors of sexual violence and young women received less attention. So as these young women and men are reintegrating back into society, those who were minors at the time have become too, quote unquote, old to be considered youth. Yet they are not fully considered women and men until certain societal benchmarks are achieved. So this begs the question of how do youth become adults and what happens when youth are unable to transition into society standard of adulthood. And Mark Summers has done extensive research on this idea of failed adulthood and being stuck. And also the Missing Peace Report notes that young women and men both struggle to transition into adulthood, but in different ways depending on the environmental context. So in Rwanda, if a male does not manage to achieve receiving a good education, owning a house, owning land, getting married, having kids, keeping a job, all of these social indicators of masculinity, if a male does not achieve that, then they're not viewed as men. So Rwanda's combination of cultural tradition and the demands of the government leave youth with few or no alternatives to traditional expectations, and without the means to meet these expectations. So youth engagement in the country's socio-political life is and has been essential in advancing Rwanda's progress. So in conclusion, participation of Rwandan youth in the global youth peace and security agenda is currently framed by multiple factors. These include recognizing youth's capabilities as agents of change, promoting youth disengagement from violent structures through the implementation of DDR measures, and integrating cultural considerations in the design and implementation of transitional justice mechanisms. So TJ processes provide youth with a vehicle for active participation and opportunities to contribute to rebuilding war-torn societies. It is thus vital for international development communities and the security communities to acknowledge that young women and men's capacities as active protagonists in peace and security efforts. So with that, I turn it back to you, Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I think that each of the panelists have offered quite complementary as well as important insights into the agenda, and I think important cautions in thinking about what's been achieved so far and what needs to be done. And so indeed, what we were going to turn to now was to actually put our panelists on the spot. And given in particular, you know, the cautions and the risks and concerns that they've raised, we're asking them now to be kind of more positive, if you like, and outline recommendations, entry points to facilitate meaningful inclusion of young people on the YPS, the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda going forward. And then I have a slightly different question for Matt. So maybe we'll turn to Marisa, Ali and Victoria to respond to this in terms of the recommendations on YPS specifically. And then for Matt, the question is more around the lessons from the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which was pointed out has a longer experience that might be valuable for efforts to advance the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. So Marisa, over to you.
All right. Thank you for that question, Jenny. Well, personally, I'm especially inspired and heartened by the increasingly visible agency of female youth in the gender, environment, and security nexus, which is a topic to which I've devoted much of my career since I was a graduate student, although I probably didn't phrase it in these terms. However, what I would like to see is more investment in the leadership of young women and men, especially those working on peace and security writ large, including environmental peace building. And when I say investment, I mean it both in terms of allocating a dedicated budget to fund youth-focused initiatives, but also investment in terms of recognition of youth leadership and capacities and agency, and of the fact that pathways to peace can take many different forms in different parts of the world. I would also like to see more partnerships and collaborative action at all levels. Young people, even when they lack the experience or the connections or the resources, they still bring their energy and enthusiasm and their particular kind of knowledge of the situation on the ground. And this must be recognized and valued, with young people viewed as equal and essential partners. And this may be the hardest one to implement. We need to acknowledge the multiple barriers, structural and cultural barriers, that constrain young people's meaningful inclusion. We need to bear in mind that in many of the conflict-affected and least developed countries where the population is the youngest, societies tend to be both patriarchal and gerontocratic. The notion of youth agency, especially female youth, is not necessarily welcome everywhere. In fact, it is often perceived as a threat to the status quo, and not just by the leaders who tend to be elders, but sometimes also by the general population. So as a result, for many young women especially, but also for young men, agency and participation in public life often come at a high price. And so what I think is important is that we be prepared to support these brave young women and men, and offer specific solutions to mitigate any possible risk. And that these need to be very contextualized, very specific to the situation in which they work, but also leveraging local capacities and sources of resilience. Okay, we need to focus on addressing both the root causes as well as the proximate causes, as well as the structural violence that relegates them to a subordinated position as both female, young, and possibly also members of an indigenous or other minority group. And only by doing this will they be able to fulfill their promise as agents for positive change in the peace and security nexus. All right, over to you.
Thank you, Marisa. Well, that's, I think, important kind of messages around investments and partnerships and support. Ali, I'm sure you've got some important insights as well.
Thank you. I will be very brief. So I think, I will be a bit short, but I hope I can catch up with whoever is interested later on. Is that I think first is that we need to be mindful about the policy dimensions here. Is that we need at the policy space, we need to liberate youth peace and security agenda, strategically liberate from counterterrorism frameworks. How this should be done is a big question, particularly keeping states' interest in this agenda, but not handing over to states. Second is that I think the way we engage young people, I think it's essential that youth peace and security agenda moves from youth peace and security to youth peace and justice discussion. Young people are driven by their lived experience of injustice. The way they engage in the youth peace and security agenda is mostly motivated by their experience of injustice. And in that respect is that we need to empower young people. I mean, we need to reevaluate what youth empowerment means and how we do it. Is that it has to be done in a way to empower young people to hold their governments accountable. It shouldn't be a tokenistic empowerment, term has been put on all youth programs. So, and the third is that we need to have drastic changes in the investment patterns. We invest very little in peace, and we invest very much in the way that war continues. I mean, so this doesn't need a lot of justification. And the issue here is that for very little amount of young people that we are speaking about as the potential extremists, we invest so much resources. We are wasting so much resources, and we are not still successful about this. So we need to reevaluate how we invest our money. And the fourth is we need to properly implement the youth peace and security agenda. What I mean by this is that we can't just look at government policies or what UN does or what INGOs does to assess what implementation of youth peace and security agenda is. We need to engage young people, consult with them, and see what are their priorities, how they are, and engage them in the assessments of the global youth peace and security agenda. This would be also facilitates countering securitization of young people. So, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ali. And I think that we'll follow up on some of those in some of the audience questions. I'm tempted to follow up now, but let's continue. Victoria, what recommendations and entry points would you advance on youth peace and security?
Yeah, sure. Just to echo what Ali mentioned earlier in his presentation about engaging and opening the avenues for female and male youth, particularly when it comes to rebuilding and to rebuilding civic spaces and that participation in that arena. And Rwanda, which is one of the only countries in Africa where women constitute a majority in the government, it's therefore crucial to focus on providing and investing in resources for young women in this space. Another recommendation, efforts to adequately engage female youth as well as male youth in peace building. It will fall short if policymakers fail to acknowledge the intersectionality of youth, especially if efforts lack proper cultural frameworks. And again, as the international community, we should also continue to ask ourselves to what extent are young women and young women's voices are not only just being heard, but being applied and acted on. Yeah.
Great. And Matt, over to you for kind of possible lessons from the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
Yes, thank you, Jenny, and that's a great question. So I think there are many possible lessons. I'll focus on two. First, I think a theme I'm hearing underlying a lot of this discussion is the need to de-siloize YPS, and particularly in our chapter, we talk about not putting YPS and women, peace, and security in different silos. And I think that's important not only between the two agendas, but also within the agendas. So looking at a lot of the scholarship that's been done on both agendas, I noticed that a lot of the focus was on the pillars of the YPS agenda and sort of which ones are the most important: protection, prevention, or participation. And I think when you look at the actual activities on YPS and WPS on the ground, the pillars really reinforce each other. So an example I'll take is Colombia, which in 2016, there was a peace accord signed with the FARC, with the government. And in the talks leading up to that accord, women's groups played a prominent role. So there was actually a gender subcommission at the Havana talks. And through this participation, these women's groups were able to obtain an agreement in the accord that there would be no amnesty for sexual violence and conflict. And that was, I think, a major example of how women's participation, or could be youth participation, can lead to benefits to other pillars. So I don't think they should be siloized. And the last lesson is I just want to draw attention to the importance of data. We used data in our chapter, but also noted that data that's both gender and age disaggregated can be hard to come by. And so without data, it can be difficult to know what policies are working and where policies are needed. So I think more attention needs to be paid to that. But I also know that there are a lot of students and young peace builders listening today, and I would just encourage folks that if you're trying to figure out, how to be involved in peace building, that data is always really useful. I learned this as someone with a law background who had not worked on data, who now I think understands how useful it is, that if you can get the tools to work with that, it can be useful for making arguments and advancing policy.
Thanks so much, Matt. We've gotten, I think, kind of 20, 25 questions, both pre-submitted and just now today, and we have about 15 minutes left. I think it'll be difficult to address them all, but there are, I think, some great points being raised. So what I might do is direct them to members of our panel who might be best placed to address them, with apologies in advance that we won't be able to cover them all. We hope that there'll be a chance for kind of follow up in various ways after the session today. So let me start with one that I think picks up on what Ali was talking about. We had a question from Jennifer Menninger in Germany, who was asking about basically about the overall success of the resolution on youth, peace and security. But she was also asking which countries are trailblazers and why. So which countries actually have achieved at least some success in moving forward. And I might just give you a double hander, Ali, if you don't mind, in case we don't have time to come back, because I think it's somewhat related. There was a question about youth-led organizations and how they operate, how they coordinate and influence their constituencies, and what are the implications of that for dialogue and mediation. And that came from a senior advisor at UNDPPA, Richard Smith. So let me throw those both to you, Ali, and then we'll proceed with some of the other great questions we've gotten. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. I will be brief for others to be able to take the floor as well. So for the which states championing this agenda and who is implementing it or who's trailblazing this? So to that question, so we at the international policy level, in the multilateral system at the UN, so we know the main actors who really push this as state agency states is that Jordan, Sweden, Peru, Dominican Republic, France, they all contribute to this agenda by contribute to this agenda by adopting resolution. I mean, let the adoption of the resolutions. I mean, so that's but the question is a little actually tricky. Is that because success, measuring success at the UN Security Council is going to be very different than at the country level. So the common trend, which I think, based on my observation, is that between states, is that some states sees youth peace and security agenda as an extension of counterterrorism, and there are other states who see youth peace and security agenda as an agenda for inclusion and participation, as a vehicle for the implementation of sustaining peace agenda. Some overlap, of course, but YPS remains on this tightrope between, in my view, one securitized approach and other one inclusive approach. So YPS is going to remain on this tightrope, I think, for next decades. And at the country level, I think the question becomes even more tricky, because it's who assess, how, and on what basis. This question is very challenging from youth perspective. And as young people don't trust their governments, why should they trust the way their governments is going to implement or assess the implementation? So the issue here becomes about how much young people can hold their governments accountable, how we are going to engage young people, what participatory processes will work for young people's assessment of the global YPS agenda in the implementation. This is going to be very context specific, and young people as moving target, their needs are changing in every generation. So briefly to the other question around how young people coordinate and influence their constituencies. So I think the issue here is a lot about, for me, issue is a lot about how we are going to link youth-led peace-building work to mediation, to the mediation work. Because when we look at the peace-building work at the community level, we will see young people. But when you look at the formally mediated processes by external actors, you will see almost no young person. And the way young people can influence these constituencies is going to be mostly from outside of the peace negotiation rooms. And this is the main argument that I put in with Grenade, my co-researcher in the We Are Here paper, that young people influence these mediated processes mostly from civic spaces, and which we see young people from the securitization debate. When we look at it, we see young people in the civic spaces as a factor for fear, insecurity. But actually, mediators should kind of change their mentality around how they can engage young people outside for the durability of peace processes, peace negotiations. So I think the issue goes a lot about how we engage young people. I mean, it's a lot about youth and peace building, how this is being linked to mediation work. So I will hand over back to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ali. A lot there, but let me turn now to Marisa and ask you, Marisa, to address a couple of great questions we got from colleagues at the Children's Foreign Policy and Funding Initiative, Caitlin Lee, who asked about the structural changes which are needed to be able to elevate and involve young people in the peace and security agenda in the US and bring in youth voices. And then a somewhat related question from Bohan Francouz at the Center on CIC, Center on International Cooperation at the New York University, who asked, whether and how youth can leverage the Global Fragility Act to advance peace building efforts. So Marisa, your reflections on those would be most welcome.
All right, thank you for those questions. And both of them pertain to the domestic situation here in the US. I would like to begin my response by clarifying that the book focuses on the global and international arena, not on the US global situation. That would be the topic of my next book, or actually 2 books from now, because the next one, which is already mostly done, focuses on all of these issues, but specifically on South Sudan, which is one of the countries where I've been conducting longitudinal field research for over 15 years now. But I can offer a few suggestions, a few reflections rather. So with respect to the potential changes that may be needed in order to incorporate youth peace and security agenda into US agencies, I think that what I would recommend as a first step is to take stock of what is already being done and how effective it is. Attention to youth is increasing in recent years, but it's hardly new. And many agencies in the US are already incorporating a focus on youth in their programming. USAID is the first example that comes to mind. And I know this because I have evaluated a number of their funded interventions that focused on youth. I will not discuss any of the specific details, but I have plenty of evidence that a focus of youth on youth is already present. And I would, for instance, mention a particular framework known as positive youth development. And this is the topic of an entire chapter in the Securitizing Youth book by Carol McNeil. And in that chapter, she discusses some success stories and other examples, perhaps not so successful, of the implementation of positive youth development, this paradigm that I was referring to. And this framework illustrates that to achieve this a vision of healthy, productive, and engaged youth, these programs, practices, and policies must work with youth in order to improve their assets, their agency, their contributions, and the enabling environment in which they work. As Carol herself recognizes, what we need is additional evidence to demonstrate their effectiveness. So when it comes to US programming, I think the issue is not one of presence, young people are present, but one of representation. Okay, how when programming either includes or focuses on young people, how are they represented? What does the program attempt to achieve? And how effective it is to include them in programming. There's quite a difference between saying that young people deserve to be included and brought up to the table versus the claim that by doing so, by including young people in programming, the likelihood that the intervention will be effective increases by, the likelihood increases is quite a different matter. And I think that we need, as I said, to build the evidence base. There's quite a large body of literature on youth and development and youth and peace building and youth and conflict, more on conflict than on peace building. But a lot of it is descriptive and exploratory. Some of it is hypothesis testing, but not enough of it is evaluative. Okay? And although evaluations have become more of a common practice, there remains a problematic tendency to confuse output with outcome. And so many of these programs that are already being implemented claim to be successful, for instance, because so many hundred young people participated in the program and they stop there. Well, that is an output, not an outcome. There's far less analysis of whether that participation actually resulted in a benefit for the participants. What were the actual outcomes of that involvement, of that participation? What was the impact of that of that program. And this is what we're lacking. And so again, I don't think that we need in many respects to reinvent the wheel and put a different label on what we're doing and call it something else. Again, begin by taking stock of what is already there and have much more clarity on whether it is being effective or not on the basis of rigorous evaluations that focus on outcome and impact as opposed to merely on output. Okay. Now, the other question was about the global.
So we might just go to the other panelists, unless you want to
All
be.
right.
We've only got about 2 minutes left.
All right. In that case, I don't want to hog all the remaining time because I have quite a lot to say about the Global Fragility Act, but I can summarize it into one sentence, which is that it is a very promising framework, recognizing that it is a tool, and like any tool, whether it is effective in improving the environment for the young population to participate in these programs depend on how the tool is actually implemented. On paper, it looks very promising, but I think that many of us are very keen on watching how it develops and how it is actually applied in practice. And I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you so much, Marisa, and sorry to cut you off.
Of course.
And I'll just turn to Matt and Victoria for really brief responses, kind of 1 minute max. I'll ask Matt first to just reflect on the connections between health equity and gender equality and how that might relate to peaceful societies and less conflict. That was, I think, a great question from Sarah Kosovich at the Karolinska Institute.
Yep, that's a great question. And I think it's really important because we do know there are associations between poor health outcomes and especially fragility and conflict. So in a number of fragile and conflict states, for example, there are high maternal mortality rates. And so as a country example, I think it's difficult to parse out whether health outcomes or gender equality outcomes necessarily lead to peaceful societies, but I would point to the example of Liberia, where there's been a lot of interesting research done on the prevalence of intimate partner violence, actually, and its relationship with conflict. And it's sort of a growing body of new research, but it points to a link between IPV and societal conflict and shows that in areas where IPV is more prevalent, these areas actually experienced more conflict during the war there. So I think it's an interesting place to look at that question.
Thanks so much, Matt. And then finally, and not least, we had another question from the University of Manitoba from Paula Thorne, who was asking about, I guess, a basic question, perhaps we should have started with this, about defining what we mean by youth in terms of age groups and different cultural perceptions of what comprises youth. I mean, I think that could be a different book. Maybe that's like the third in the line in Marisa's books now. But Victoria, can you kind of reflect briefly on that one? You don't need to cover the waterfront, but just give us a sense.
Sure. Well, in the West, we have this chronological understanding of what it is to be young and how we define age. But from a sociological, anthropological framework, the reality is that there are different understandings of what it is and what is required to enter the category of social adulthood. So in many cultures, this description of age, it's not prescribed, but as Marisa mentions in the book as well, it's achieved. So what is required to transition to a social womanhood varies from culture to culture. Yeah, but like you said, could be a whole nother book.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria. And thanks to so many of you who submitted, I think, really quite interesting and important questions. And I think those questions as well underline the importance of the agenda kind of going forward. I think that Ali made the important point about its relevance to the durability of justice and peace. I think a recurring theme was also the potential kind of two-edged sword of having these kind of UN agendas and UN resolutions, but also the ways in which they might be leveraged and pursued to help to advance underlying objectives in terms of reform. I think another kind of recurring theme, and it also comes up from the questions, is that there's a real thirst for understanding kind of what works, what can be done to help to achieve kind of concrete change. But I think likewise a recurring theme is the importance of context, and understanding specificities. And again, sorry to quote you again, Ali, but I did like your line about youth being a moving target. I guess we don't want to be using military analogies, but I think, understanding kind of the specificities and that any solutions, will not be set in stone, because, the contexts are dynamic, youth are dynamic, and, we need to kind of adapt in order to be able to contribute to change. But thank you all for joining. I think the recording itself will be posted, and we would encourage you to share. We would also encourage you, of course, to at least look at, if not buy the book. The link is in the, or order it from your library. The link is in the chat. Thanks to Marisa again for leading this effort, and thanks, hearty thanks to my colleagues at the Georgetown Institute, Jessica Keller and Alexandra Smith, for enabling this to happen today. So goodbye, everybody.